They strung her up at dawn. Her ankles, tied tight with horse rope, dug into her skin. They hoisted her up on the hitching post right in the middle of Main Street, leaving her to swing like a slab of butchered meat. The blood from her temples dripped down, pooling in her eyes, making the whole upside-down world a blurry, terrifying red. Beneath her, a crudely painted sign read, "Thief." The red paint was still wet, dripping onto the cracked wood. The wind, as if ashamed of the whole affair, kept slapping the sign sideways, trying to hide the word. Her name was Rhea, a name nobody in the town of Hollow Creek dared to say out loud anymore. She hadn't stolen money. She hadn't stolen food. She had stolen herbs, wild roots and leaves she'd gathered from the forbidden woods, the kind her mother had taught her were for healing, for mending, for giving breath back to those who were losing it. The preacher's wife had been wasting away, a terrible cough rattling her thin frame. Rhea, remembering the old ways, had left a bundle of those very herbs on their doorstep. She didn't ask for payment. She didn't even ask for thanks. But the herbs had a scent, a powerful, earthy smell that clung to the air. And that scent was her signature. That's when they came for her. The preacher, a man whose piety was as thin as his lips, didn't see a gift. He saw a curse. He stormed through the town, his voice booming with righteous fury. "She has cursed my wife! Those are not plants of God! They are savage tricks of the devil!" he screamed. The town, fueled by fear and a hunger for spectacle, turned on her in an instant. "Witch!" they spat. "Sorceress!" Sheriff Dodd, a man who wore his badge like a shield for his own cowardice, just nodded. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look for proof. He simply gave the order. The blacksmith, a hulking man named Thomas with hands like shovels, tied the knots himself, his face a mask of grim duty. They told her she was lucky. Lucky they weren't burning her. So now she hung, her world reduced to dust, blood, and the stench of stale beer from the saloon nearby. Her dark hair, once braided with wildflowers, now dragged through the dirt. A few drunks jeered from the saloon porch. A child, clutching her mother's skirt, pointed a small finger. "Mama, why is that lady upside down?" The mother pulled the child close, her voice cold and hard. "Because she broke the law, honey. That's what happens to people who break the law." But the law in Hollow Creek was a fickle thing. It was loud and cruel when there was an audience, but silent and blind when no one was watching. And today, everyone was watching. Everyone and everything. Because tied to the post, just a few feet away, stood the town's most prized possession. Marshall Glay's Palomino sable, a magnificent horse with a coat like spun gold and a chest puffed out with pride. His name was Sable, and he was the marshal's pride and joy, a symbol of his power and wealth. After they'd strung Rhea up, they tried to lead the horse away, but Sable wouldn't move. He planted his hooves in the thick dust and refused to budge, not for the sweet grain they offered, not for the sharp crack of the whip against his flank. Not even when Marshall Glay himself, his face turning a blotchy red, yanked the reins so hard the leather groaned. Sable stood as still as a stone statue. His head was turned toward Rhea's swinging body, his ears pinned back, his dark, intelligent eyes fixed on her. "Damned beast's gone mad," someone in the crowd muttered. But as the morning sun climbed higher, scorching the dusty street, and the crowd began to thin, it became terrifyingly clear. The only living soul in Hollow Creek who refused to turn away from the dying woman was the animal. And in that heavy, suffocating quiet, something began to shift. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a standoff. A silent, defiant challenge issued by a horse. Rhea, drifting in a haze of pain, blinked the blood from her eyes. Through the red curtain, she saw 4 powerful hooves planted firmly in the earth. She heard the steady, rhythmic sound of breathing, a sound that was somehow more comforting than any human voice. and deep beneath the searing pain of the ropes and the throbbing of her split lip, she felt a strange, impossible flicker of hope. This wasn't her fight to start, but she had a terrifying feeling it just might end with her feet back on the ground. By midday, the sun was a merciless hammer in the sky. Ria's face was swollen, her lips cracked and bleeding. The thirst was a living thing, a fire clawing at her throat. No one brought her water, no one dared. To show her kindness was to align yourself with a witch, to invite the same judgment upon your own head. She was already a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered to naughty children. But Sable hadn't moved, not an inch. The great golden horse stood his ground, his massive body a living shield between her and the town. He only moved to swish his tail when the flies grew too bold, landing on the bloody welts on Ria's back. Marshal Glay, his pride stung raw, decided he'd had enough. He stomped back out into the square, his face a thundercloud of fury. He tried tempting Sable with a block of salt, his voice a low, wheedling growl. "Come on now, boy. Good boy." The horse ignored him completely. Glay's patience snapped. "Move, you stubborn bastard!" he roared, and he brought the leather reins down hard, again and again, against the Palomino's powerful flank. The horse flinched, a tremor running through its muscles, but its hooves seemed to dig even deeper into the packed earth. His wide, dark eyes never left Ria. "He's bewitched," the marshal spat, stumbling back as if the horse itself was cursed. "That witch has tainted his blood." But his outburst had the opposite effect he intended. The townspeople, who had been trying to ignore the grim spectacle, started watching again. But they weren't looking at Ria anymore. They were looking at the horse. For the first time, they truly saw the way Sable stood, not like an animal tethered to a post, but like a guardian, a sentinel placed there by some ancient, unspoken law that was far older and more powerful than their own petty rules. Whispers started to ripple through the alleys and behind closed doors. "He didn't even stand that still for the judge at the county fair," one man murmured. "The preacher tried to bless him with holy water an hour ago," a woman whispered to her neighbor. Sable nearly took his hand off. The fear was starting to curdle into something else. Awe, confusion, a creeping, unsettling doubt. As evening approached, casting long, skeletal shadows across the street, the barkeep's wife, a stout woman named Martha, slipped out of the saloon. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, her hands trembling as she clutched a damp rag. She didn't try to untie Ria. She didn't say a word. She just reached out and gently, carefully, dabbed at the crusted blood on the girl's neck. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but in the charged atmosphere of Hollow Creek, it was a thunderclap. "She helped my boy with his cough last winter," Martha mumbled to the empty air, her voice thick with a shame she could no longer swallow. Then she turned and hurried back inside before anyone could stop her. No one did. That night, the wind changed. It grew sharper, colder, as if it was trying to scour the sin from the town's bones. Ria drifted in and out of consciousness, a feverish haze filled with the ghosts of voices. But through it all, one sound remained constant, the slow, deep rhythm of a horse's breath right beside her. The scent of hay and horse sweat was more real to her now than her own pain. She dreamed of her mother, singing in a language she had almost forgotten, a language of the earth and the trees. A name was repeated in the song, a gentle, loving chant. Ria, Ria, Ria. Just after midnight, a small shape darted out from the shadows of the general store. It was a child, no older than 7. He crept forward, placed a crust of bread on the ground just inches from Ria's dangling hand, and then ran off into the darkness before his mother could catch him. The rope creaked. Her body screamed. But something in Hollow Creek, something brittle and rotten, had finally cracked, and it wasn't her spine. The second dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange, and Sable was still there. Same spot, same unwavering gaze fixed on the woman who hung like a broken doll. But his presence no longer felt like a curiosity. It felt like an accusation. Marshal Glay hadn't slept. He'd paced the boardwalk all night, his heavy boots clomping a rhythm of pure frustration. "Hang a witch, the devil sends her a horse," he'd muttered to himself, his voice raw with fury and a creeping dread he couldn't name. He wanted to order another lashing, to break her spirit, to reassert his control, but he couldn't. Because the eyes of the town were no longer just on the girl. They were on him. They were on Sheriff Dodd. They were on the preacher. The blacksmith who had tied the ropes now refused to meet anyone's gaze, keeping his eyes fixed on his anvil as if his life depended on it. The story was changing, slipping through the marshal's fingers like sand. Is she still breathing?" a farmer asked from the steps of the general store. His question was met by another, whispered from the shadows of the alley. "Is she still human?" Then the silence was broken. Old Saul Briggs, a man who hadn't spoken a full sentence since the railroad company had taken his land and his only son, shuffled out of his small shack. He was a ghost of a man, all bones and regret. He carried a rusty tin can filled with water. He didn't look at the marshal. He didn't look at the crowd. He walked straight to Rhea. With a hand that trembled from age, not fear, he soaked the edge of his threadbare sleeve in the can and gently touched the damp cloth to Rhea's cracked, swollen lips. A flicker of movement. A soft, almost inaudible sigh. It was enough. Saul nodded once, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. He leaned in close, his voice a dry rasp, meant only for her but heard by the wind. "They hanged my boy for less than what you did," he whispered. He was innocent, too. He left the can of water on the ground and walked away, his silence returning as suddenly as it had left. The town held its breath, waiting for the marshal to explode. But he didn't. He couldn't. To punish the old man now would be to admit defeat. No one stormed the sheriff's office. No one started a riot. But the dam of fear had broken, and now the kindness came in a trickle, then a stream. A young girl left a woolen shawl draped over the fence post. The schoolteacher, a stern woman who had always preached obedience, walked by and muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "This has gone on long enough." And still, the horse remained, a silent, golden judge. Finally, Marshal Glay threw his hands in the air, not in surrender to the woman, but to the animal that had so thoroughly defied him. "Fine," he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "Let him rot out here with her, see if I care." But just as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the scene, a figure appeared at the end of the street. It was the preacher's wife. She walked slowly, unsteadily, but she was upright. Her skin was pale, but her breathing was even. The rattling cough was gone. She stopped directly in front of Rhea. She looked up at the bruised, broken body of the woman accused of cursing her. Then she looked at the magnificent horse standing guard. Her lips parted, and a single, trembling whisper escaped. "I was wrong." It was too quiet for any human to hear over the evening breeze, but Sable heard it. The horse lifted his head and pawed the dirt. Once. A single, powerful stomp. The sound echoed through the silent square like a clap of thunder, a drumbeat of judgment. Rhea, hanging on the edge of oblivion, felt the vibration through the post, up the rope, and into her very bones. The sound jolted her back to life. Her eyes, which had been swollen shut, fluttered open. They were no longer hazy with pain. They were clear. They were defiant. They were alive. A woman in the crowd gasped, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to suck all the air out of the square. The sound carried, echoing off the false fronts of the buildings, startling a gambler in the saloon into dropping his cards. Rhea's eyes were open, and she wasn't looking at the crowd, or the preacher's wife, or the marshal. She was staring straight at Sable, a look of profound, silent communication passing between them. The sheriff tried to laugh it off, a nervous, hollow sound. "She's just delirious. She'll pass out again." But no one was listening to him anymore. Something had irrevocably shifted. The air was thick with it, a terrifying, thrilling expectation. This was no longer a punishment. It was becoming a reckoning. And that's when a new player stepped onto the stage. Jory Bell. A boy of 17, all lanky limbs and sunburned skin, the kind of gentle soul who was relentlessly mocked for not being man enough. His own father, the blacksmith, regularly took a belt to him, trying to beat the softness out. Jory walked out of the barber shop, a pair of gleaming steel shears still clutched in his hand. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with a fire no one had ever seen in him before. He didn't look at anyone. He just walked. He walked straight past the sheriff, straight past the marshal. He walked right up to the hitching post, reached behind Rhea's limp form, and with one swift, decisive motion, he sliced through the thick rope holding her ankles. There was a sickening thud as her body dropped to the ground, landing in a heap like a sack of grain. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Rhea didn't scream. She let out a choked, ragged breath and curled in on herself, clutching her ribs. Jory knelt beside her. He didn't hesitate. He took his shears and carefully cut the ropes that bound her wrists. "This ain't right," he said, his voice soft but clear in the dead silence. He wasn't talking to the crowd. He wasn't even talking to her. He was talking to the earth, to the sky, to the shame that hung over all of them. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the entire town had forgotten how to breathe. Sable took a single step back, his hoof stamping the ground once more. A period at the end of a sentence. Rhea coughed, a dry, racking sound that sent a spasm of pain through her. But she pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her body was broken, but her spirit was not. When Jory reached out a hand to help her, she slapped it away. Not with anger, but with a fierce, inviolable dignity. She got to her knees on her own. Then, shakily, to her feet. "I'm not broken," she whispered, her voice a raw, gravelly thing. She looked out at the sea of faces staring back at her. Some looked away, their faces burning with shame. Others just looked lost, their moral compass shattered. But nobody moved to stop her. She stumbled towards the horse trough, each step an agony. Sable followed close behind, positioning himself like a living shield at her back. She plunged her hands into the murky water, the coolness a shocking relief. Slowly, deliberately, she washed the blood and grime from her face. Then she drank. She scooped the water with her trembling hands and let it run down her throat, a sacrament of survival. She was no longer the town's victim. She was its survivor. And she dared any one of them to challenge her. They had taken her name. They had taken her freedom. They had nearly taken her life. But they hadn't taken her will. And as she stood there, barefoot in the dust, her spine bent but her gaze unbroken, a new and terrifying question began to form in the minds of the people of Hollow Creek. What had they done? And what was she going to do now? The town of Hollow Creek seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Would she scream? Would she cry for revenge? Would she collapse? She did none of those things. The preacher was the first to break, muttering something about the devil's resilience before scurrying back into the shadows of his church. His wife, the woman Rhea had supposedly cursed, lingered for a moment longer, her face a complicated mask of guilt and awe, before she too retreated. Others followed, melting back into their homes and shops, unable to bear witness to the monument of their own cruelty. Only Marshal Glay remained, his fists clenched at his sides, his face a mask of impotent rage. He had built his power on fear, but the woman in front of him was radiating something far stronger. She hadn't defeated his fear. She had simply rendered it irrelevant. He knew, and he knew, that everyone else knew, that a line had been crossed. A sin had been committed in broad daylight, and no amount of justification could wash it clean. Rhea ignored him. She walked slowly, her bare feet padding softly in the dust, over to the saloon porch. She passed the sign that still declared her a thief, without a glance. She reached up and took down the rope that had bound her, the rope still stained with her own blood. She held it for a moment, coiling it in her palm like a sleeping snake. Then, she draped it over the porch railing. A silent, damning statement. It wasn't a threat. It was a marker. A piece of their history they would now have to look at every single day. Jory Bell, the boy who had cut her down, still stood nearby, his lanky frame frozen with uncertainty. He finally found his voice, a whispered question. What? What will you do now? Rhea didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the open land beyond the town, on the rolling hills where the sky bled into the horizon, a place without rules, without preachers, without sheriffs. I'm going to find the place I was before they forgot me, she said, her voice gaining strength, before I forgot myself. With that, she turned her back on Hollow Creek. She didn't run, she walked, and Sable, untethered, uncommanded, fell into step beside her. The two of them, the outcast and the beast, moved as one, leaving the stunned and silent town behind. But the story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Because as Rhea walked away, a new, cold realization began to dawn on Marshall Glay. He hadn't just lost his authority, he had lost his horse. And that was only the first secret the horse was keeping. You see, Sable wasn't just any horse. He hadn't been born on some fancy eastern farm. The marshal had told everyone he'd paid a fortune for him, a prize palomino from a champion bloodline. It was a lie. The truth was far more damning. 5 years earlier, Marshall Glay hadn't been a marshal. He'd been a greedy, ruthless land grabber, working for the railroad. He'd been part of the posse that had driven a small, peaceful tribe of natives from the very valley where Hollow Creek now stood. They had taken the land, burned the homes, and stolen anything of value. That included a stunningly beautiful Palomino colt with a unique mark hidden under his mane, a small, intricate spiral, the symbol of the tribe's elder. The colt belonged to a young girl who cried as they dragged him away, a girl named Rhea. Sable hadn't been standing guard for a stranger. He had been standing guard for his rightful owner. He had recognized her scent, the sound of her voice even in her pained whispers. He had been waiting for her. This wasn't just a story about a horse's loyalty. This was a story about stolen history, a story about a debt coming due. Rhea walked for hours, putting as much distance as she could between herself and the town that had tried to erase her. Each step was a painful reminder of her ordeal, but it was also an act of reclamation. She was walking away from their judgment, their lies, their shame. Sable stayed with her, a constant, comforting presence. When she finally stumbled, her body giving out, he nudged her gently with his head, urging her onward. He led her not randomly into the wilderness, but with a clear purpose. He led her toward a narrow creek, hidden by a grove of ancient cottonwoods. It was a place Rhea recognized from the haze of her childhood memories. A sacred place. Tucked into the bank of the creek was a small ring of stones, nearly swallowed by moss and time. In the center were the blackened bones of a long-dead cooking fire. Her mother had brought her here, before the world had turned upside down. Rhea fell to her knees, her hands tracing the familiar shapes of the stones. She brushed away the dirt and leaves from one particular flat rock, and there it was, faint, but unmistakable. The carving of a turtle, her mother's mark, her clan's symbol, the story her own name came from, the turtle who carried the world on her back, strong and enduring. "I remember," she whispered, the words a prayer. A dam of grief and memory broke inside her, and for the first time since they'd taken her, She wept. She cried for her mother, for her people, for the life that had been stolen from her. When the tears finally stopped, she felt lighter. The shame of Hollow Creek had been washed away, replaced by something older and more powerful. Her heritage, her truth. That night, she built a fire in the ancient ring. As the flames danced, she began to remember the names of the herbs, not in the clumsy English tongue, but in her own. Taneka, Katu, Nvi. The words felt strange in her mouth, but they felt like coming home. She didn't know what the future held. She was alone, with nothing but a horse and the tattered clothes on her back. But as she looked up at the stars, undimmed by the smoke and greed of any town, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just a survivor. She was the last keeper of a flame. And she would not let it go out. Back in Hollow Creek, the silence was deafening. The rope still hung from the saloon porch, a constant ugly reminder. Marshal Glay's fury had cooled into a simmering panic. The disappearance of his prize horse was a public humiliation. He organized search parties, offered a huge reward, but it was no use. Sable had vanished as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The town tried to forget Rhea. They tried to go back to their routines, to pretend that the last 2 days had been nothing but a bad dream. But it was impossible. Her ghost was everywhere. In the empty space at the hitching post, in the uneaten crust of bread that a child had left, now being pecked at by crows, in the whispers that refused to die. The preacher's cough had returned, worse than ever. His wife watched him, her eyes cold and distant. The narrative they had all agreed upon, the story of the righteous town punishing the evil witch, had crumbled into dust. Now a new, more terrifying story was taking its place, the story of a terrible mistake, a story of a town that had condemned an innocent woman. But the truth was even darker than that, because the preacher's wife hadn't just been sick, she had been poisoned, slowly, methodically, over a period of weeks. And the person poisoning her was not some mysterious outsider. It was her own husband. The preacher, a man named Elias Thorne, had tired of his frail, aging wife. He had his eyes on a younger, wealthier woman from the next county, the daughter of a cattle baron. But divorce was unthinkable, a stain on his holy reputation. Murder, however, disguised as a tragic illness, was a viable option. He had been using a rare, colorless, odorless powder ground from a plant known as ghost root. Rhea's bundle of healing herbs, left on his doorstep, had been a catastrophic complication. He knew at a glance what they were, a powerful antidote to the very poison he was using. If his wife took them, she would recover. His plan would be ruined. Worse, Rhea, with her deep knowledge of plants, might recognize the symptoms of the poisoning and expose him. He had to act fast. He had to discredit her. And what better way to do that than to use her own gift against her? He had turned her act of kindness into an act of witchcraft. He had framed her not just to get her out of the way, but to ensure his wife would die, and that he would be seen as the grieving, pious victim. He had orchestrated the entire thing. He had whipped the town into a frenzy. He had convinced Sheriff Dodd and Marshal Glay that she was a threat to their way of life. The preacher hadn't been afraid of her cursing his wife. He had been terrified of her saving her. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed his wife was weak and oblivious. She wasn't. She had been suspicious for weeks, noticing the strange, bitter aftertaste in her tea, her husband's increasingly cold demeanor. When Rhea's herbs appeared, and her husband had reacted with such violent fury, the pieces had clicked into place. She knew. Her whispered words in the square, "I was wrong," weren't just an admission of Rhea's innocence. They were a veiled accusation aimed at her husband. She was playing a dangerous game, biding her time, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. The standoff in the town square had bought her that time. Meanwhile, in her hidden camp, Rhea was slowly healing. Her body was a road map of bruises and cuts, but each day she felt a little stronger, She and Sable had fallen into a rhythm. During the day she foraged for food and medicinal plants, her knowledge returning to her in a flood. At night, she would sit by the fire, talking to Sable, telling him stories of her people, of the world before it was broken. The horse would listen, his head bowed, his dark eyes seeming to understand everything. One morning she awoke to a strange sight. On the edge of her camp sat a small woven basket. Inside were 3 chickens clucking softly, and a small pouch of seed. There was no note, no sign of who had left it, but Rhea knew. Someone from the town remembered. Someone was trying to atone. It was Jory Bell. The boy had been following her, keeping his distance, torn between his fear of his father and the pull of his conscience. His father, the blacksmith, had been one of the men who had tied the ropes. Jory had seen the shame and fear in his father's eyes. He knew the man had been coerced by the marshal and the preacher. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could offer a small token of peace. Rhea accepted the gift. She built a small coop for the chickens, tilled a patch of soil for the seeds. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building, creating a new home, a new life, on the ruins of the old one. The town may have forgotten her name, but out here, in the quiet of the wilderness, she was speaking it again. Not in a whisper, but in a clear, strong voice that the land itself seemed to recognize. She was Rhea, and she was home. And then, one afternoon, the outside world came crashing in. She heard them before she saw them, the panicked, desperate gasps of a child running for his life, the sound of snapping twigs, too fast for a deer, too light for a man. Rhea shot to her feet, a sharpened stick clutched in her hand. Sable moved to her side, his body tense, his ears swiveling toward the sound. A small boy, no older than 8, burst into the clearing. His clothes were torn, his knees were scraped and bloody. He was clutching a small, grimy bundle, and his eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond simple fear. He skidded to a halt when he saw her, his chest heaving. They said you was a witch, he panted. But my mama said you healed her feet when the boils came, she said. She said if I ever got lost, I should find the woman with fire in her eyes. Rhea's heart clenched. She recognized him. He was the son of the barkeep's wife, Martha, the woman who had shown her the first small act of kindness. She crouched down slowly, her own bruised ribs screaming in protest. It's all right, she said softly. You're safe here. The boy's terror gave way to a wave of grief. They sold my sister, he whispered, the words choked with tears. To some men. From the trading post. They said she was payment for Papa's debts. I bit one of them. Then I ran. He held out the bundle he was carrying. It was an offering. A payment. Rhea gently unfolded the cloth. Inside were 2 stale biscuits, a piece of fabric stained with what looked like his sister's blood, and a single black crow feather. A symbol of courage. Rhea nodded, her face grim. You ran far, she said. You were very brave. The boy's strength finally gave out, and he collapsed into a heap at her feet, sobbing. Sable stepped forward, lowering his great head to nudge the boy's shoulder gently. The child flinched at first, then looked into the horse's calm, intelligent eyes and reached out a trembling hand, as if he understood that this animal was a friend. Rhea lifted the boy, whose name she learned was Leo, and carried him to the fire. She made him a warm broth, cleaned his cuts with a poultice of chewed yarrow leaves, and tended to his exhaustion. She took the crow feather he had brought and tucked it into the woven reeds of her small shelter. It was not a decoration. It was a promise. Someone had trusted her. Someone small and brave had come to her for help. That night, as Leo slept curled against Sable's warm belly, Rhea sat by the fire, a sharpened knife in her hand and streaks of ash, the symbol of war, on her cheekbones. Her plans had changed. It was no longer enough to simply survive, to hide from the world. Hollow Creek wasn't just a town filled with cowards and fools. It was rotten to the core. It was a place where children were sold to settle debts, a place where men like Marshall Glay and the preacher operated with impunity. She had thought her fight was over. Now she knew it had just found its true purpose. She wasn't just going to get Leo's sister back. She was going to tear their whole corrupt world down. The healing she needed to do now didn't require soft herbs and gentle hands. It required teeth. 2 days later, Rhea stood on a ridge overlooking Whisper Rock, a notorious trading post known for its lawlessness. Leo was asleep on Sable's back, wrapped in a warm blanket. The journey had been hard, but Rhea's purpose had given her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She hadn't needed a map. The trail left by the wagon was a story of its own. The deep ruts of a heavy load, the crushed berries on the path, the small, desperate footprints of a child being dragged against her will. The trading post was a hive of scum and villainy, a collection of ramshackle buildings reeking of cheap whiskey and desperation. Men with dead eyes and guns on their hips watched every newcomer with suspicion. This was not a place for a lone woman and a child. But Rhea was not just a lone woman anymore. She was a force of nature. She left Leo and Sable hidden in a grove of trees and walked into the post alone. She moved with a confidence that made people look twice. Her face was set like stone, her eyes burning with an intensity that dared anyone to challenge her. She didn't ask questions, she just watched. And then she saw her. A little girl, maybe 10 years old, with the same fiery red hair as Leo. She was sitting on a crate outside the main building, her eyes glazed over with shock and despair. A big, greasy man in a leather coat stood nearby, keeping a proprietary eye on her. Rhea didn't hesitate. She walked straight up to the girl, ignoring the man completely. She knelt down and looked the child in the eye. "Your brother Leo," she said, her voice low and steady. "He bid a man for you. He sent me." The girl's eyes, which had been dull and lifeless, flickered. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. The tension that had been holding her rigid seemed to snap, and she let out a small, choked sob. The man in the leather coat finally took notice. He swaggered over, a cruel smirk on his face. "That one belonged to you, missy?" he sneered. Rhea stood up slowly, turning to face him. Her voice was as calm and cold as a river in winter. "She does now." The man laughed, a short, ugly bark. He reached out to grab Rhea's arm. "I don't think so. She's paid for." But before his fingers could touch her, a shadow fell over them. Sable had followed her. The great horse stepped between Rhea and the man, silent as a ghost. He didn't rear. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, a mountain of golden muscle and protective fury. His eyes were locked on the man, and they held a promise of swift, terrible violence. The man froze, his hand hovering in midair. His smirk vanished, replaced by a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. He looked from the terrifyingly calm woman to the even more terrifying horse, and his bravado evaporated. He slowly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. He didn't know what kind of devilry this was, but he wanted no part of it. Rhea didn't give him a second glance. She took the little girl's hand, her name was Lily, and turned her back on the trading post. She walked away without looking back. No one dared to follow. That night, around a small, hidden fire, Lily finally told her story. "Mama died from the fever," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Papa started drinking. He said we were payment for his debts." Rhea listened, her heart aching for these 2 lost children. She taught Lily how to stir the fire with a cedar branch, how to read the patterns in the smoke to predict the wind. She was no longer just teaching them survival skills. She was passing on her heritage, giving them back a piece of the world that had been stolen from them. For the first time in a very long time, Rhea smiled. A true, genuine smile. She wasn't safe. She wasn't free. But she had a purpose. She had a family. She was no longer just a woman who had survived a hanging. She was a fire, gathering strength, ready to burn away the rot. And she knew exactly where she was going to strike first. They returned to Hollow Creek at dawn, 3 days later. They didn't sneak back in under the cover of darkness. They walked right down the middle of Main Street as the sun was rising, their arrival a deliberate, defiant proclamation. Rhea walked in front, her head held high. Her hair was woven into 2 tight braids, and across her back was a bundle of sage and other herbs. Coiled at her waist, for all the world to see, was the blood-stained rope she had been hung with. It wasn't a weapon. It was a declaration of war. Behind her, Sable walked with a proud, steady gait. On his back sat Leo and Lily, no longer looking like frightened, broken children. Their faces were clean, their eyes were clear, and they sat up straight, their small hands gripping the horse's mane. They were no longer victims. They were Rhea's tribe. The town awoke to the sound of Sable's hooves on the wooden boardwalk, a sound like a slow, deliberate drumbeat of judgment. Faces began to appear in windows, peering out from behind lace curtains. Doors creaked open. People stepped out of the saloon and the general store, their morning routines forgotten. A crowd began to gather, silent and uncertain. They stared at Rhea, at the children, at the magnificent horse. They saw the rope at her waist, and a collective shudder of shame and fear went through them. Rhea didn't stop until she reached the hitching post, the scene of her torture. Without a word, she uncoiled the rope from her waist and, with practiced ease, tied it back exactly where it had been before. The knot was high and tight, the stained red a stark accusation against the morning light. But she wasn't finished. She reached into the pouch at her side and pulled out 3 objects: a bundle of braided sweetgrass and cedar, a symbol of cleansing and truth; a scrap of red ribbon torn from the dress Lily had been wearing when she was sold; and a single black crow feather, the one Leo had carried on his desperate flight. She tied these items to the hanging rope, transforming the instrument of her torture into a powerful, damning shrine. It was a story told without words, a testament to their crimes that they would have to face every single day. Just then, Marshal Glay stormed out onto the boardwalk, his face purple with rage. Sheriff Dodd was right behind him, looking pale and nervous. "What do you think you're doing?" Glay bellowed, his hand instinctively going to the gun on his hip. "You have no claim here, witch. Get out of my town." Rhea turned to face him, and her eyes were like chips of flint. "This was never your town, Marshal," she said, her voice ringing with a power that silenced the crowd. "You just stole it." She looked past him, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the townspeople. "I didn't come back for revenge," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I came back so you would see. I came back so you would know the truth." She pointed a finger at the preacher, who was trying to shrink back into the crowd. "Ask your preacher why he tried to poison his wife. Ask him why he was so terrified of the healing herbs I brought her." A gasp went through the crowd. The preacher's wife, who was standing on the steps of the church, let out a small cry and pointed a trembling finger at her husband. "It's true. He did it. He tried to kill me." The crowd erupted into chaos. The carefully constructed lies of Hollow Creek were shattering like glass. Rhea wasn't done. She turned her attention back to the marshal. "And ask your marshal where he really got this horse," she commanded. She walked over to Sable and gently pushed aside his golden mane, revealing the skin beneath. There, clear as day, was the faint, scarred spiral of the turtle, her family's mark. "This horse was stolen from my people, just like this land was stolen, just like these children were stolen and sold to pay debts this town profits from." The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place: the horse's mysterious vigil, the preacher's frantic accusations, the marshal's desperate lies. It was all part of the same rotten tapestry, The crowd, which had once been a mob crying for her blood, now turned its fury on the men who had deceived them. They surged forward, their faces contorted with rage. Marshal Glay and Sheriff Dodd, seeing that the tide had turned irrevocably against them, drew their guns. But before they could fire, Jory Bell, the blacksmith's son, stepped forward. He wasn't holding scissors this time. He was holding his father's heavy hammer. And behind him stood his father, and the barkeep, and old Saul Briggs, and a dozen other men who had finally found their courage. The standoff was short and decisive. The marshal and the sheriff were disarmed and overwhelmed, their authority vanishing in an instant. The preacher was dragged from the church by his own congregation, his pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. Justice had finally come to Hollow Creek. Not the false justice of a rope and a sign, but the real, messy, painful justice of truth. Rhea watched it all, her face impassive. She had planted the seeds, and now she was watching the harvest. She turned to Leo and Lily. "It's time to go," she said softly. She helped the children onto Sable's back, and without a backward glance at the town that was tearing itself apart to be reborn, she led them away. They passed the saloon, where Jory Bell stood in the doorway. He met her eyes and nodded once, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. They passed the church, where the preacher's wife stood watching them go, her face filled with a sorrowful understanding. As they reached the edge of town, where the dirt road dissolved into the wilderness, Lily turned to look back. "Are we free now?" she asked, her small voice filled with wonder. Rhea looked ahead, toward the hidden valley, toward the ring of stones, toward the future she would build for them. "We're fed," she said. "We're together. We're strong. That's how freedom starts." Behind them, the rope with its talismans of truth swayed in the morning wind. The town of Hollow Creek had a long, painful road ahead, but for Rhea and her children, the journey was just beginning. They were heading home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of justice and survival. We all face moments where we have to choose between staying silent and speaking the truth. What would you have done if you were a citizen of Hollow Creek that day? Let us know in the comments below.